Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Al and Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep.
Hi Lara, what have you got for us today?
Got a few questions.
Exciting.
I was expecting that.
Given it's the middle of summer, can I plant my autumn pasture too early?
Yes, you can. There's a few points to a very broad question like that. If you have irrigation, you do not hit temperatures too far in excess of 30. You can certainly plant almost at any time, but you would want to be very careful of having too hot conditions through the summer. And also you'd want to be careful with soil types where the water can stay on the surface, because you can get a bit of stewing go on if you get 30, 35 degree days with water pooling on young pasture. That's not great for it. However, if you're not irrigated, know that you wouldn't sow in the middle of summer. It's too extreme. The chances of a false strike are extremely high, and there's many hot and dry days ahead of you. And so you are best to wait for the moisture profile to improve and the day length and temperature to just pivot away from the hottest times of the season.
I'll add nothing.
Cool. Juddy, who do you think would play Al in his life movie? And Al, who do you think would play Juddy in his life movie?
I'll answer first because that's easy for me, as Hugh Jackman for Juddy. He came back from a sabbatical in Ireland, rocking some huge chops, and I think he got a free coffee in one of the stopover venues when someone mistook him for Hugh Jackman. Probably a greyish Hugh Jackman, but the reality is when he does his sideys, he does have a resemblance.
I'll take that any day.
Yeah, something tells me mine won't be as positive.
I reckon that the person playing you would be Graham Norton, right? And the way I say it is because like he's a talk show host and he makes his living out of talking, and I think that he'd be very appropriate.
I really appreciate that.
You could either take that as compliment or not. I don't know.
Exactly. I saw that coming though.
If you have any questions, technical, serious, lighthearted, or anything in between, hit us up on our socials, Agricom NZ, or the Al and Juddy Facebook page, or email us at info@agricom.co.nz.
Thanks, Lara.
G'day, Alistair. Good to see you again. Really like that brown cardi. I guess it'll come back into fashion at some point.
Well, according to Lara for marketing, Juddy, they're back in fashion now. Thank you very much.
Oh, maybe I'm out of fashion. Anyway, what are we talking about today on today's podcast?
We're talking about paddock rotations.
Right. Oh, I love how the earth rotates. It really makes my day.
Oh, Juddy, that's a shocker. As I always say. So, if you don't mind, I will move on. I will rotate directly into the topics and introduction to what we're going to cover today in this podcast.
And so what are we talking? We're talking about paddock rotations.
Yes.
What do we mean by a paddock rotation?
Well, we're talking about the whole farm in real terms, but when you break a farm up, it's broken up into groups of paddocks that are at different parts of their life cycle as far as a pastoral phase. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to cover very simple rotations that work our way through moving from a grass pasture to a grass pasture. And then we're going to delve into what rotations look like on farms that are from cold regions in New Zealand and what changes your rotations within those farming practices. We'll then pivot into what that looks like for summer dry environments, which have warm winters, and discuss what rotations look like on those farming systems. And then we'll probably finish on what I consider probably the sort of the poster child of what is creating rotations all about in the New Zealand farming system, which is based around runoffs and dairy support, which are basically, these are feed factories, and we're all about how you stack yield over time and in a certain time frame because of the scope and the amount of land you have available.
So really, if you want to distill this down, we're actually talking about the sequence of different crops and pastures in a paddock over time.
Correct.
And I think what I like about this is that you can plan this out for 7, 8, 10 years and longer, and then modify that as we see what's happening in the paddock or
neighbouring paddocks.
Or
with individual management events.
Absolutely. But it's having this the sequence that you can impose over all of your paddocks or some of your paddocks that allows you to plan forward. Because I think the power of these rotations is that you can do something now that could benefit you in 2 years' time in terms of cleaning up weeds or, as you said, stacking yield. So
100%. And I think no one likes to think of it like this. You like to think that every moment you've got all these decisions and you've got all these choices. But what's great when you settle and recognize that your farm is driven by a paddock rotation and a multiple paddocks and everything's at its place in those rotations, it suddenly means that you don't have as many decisions in life as you believe and you need. So it doesn't overcomplicate your job if you acknowledge that there is a logical rotation that exists, and that your job is just to recognize that when you mess with those rotations, you create problems elsewhere. And so the more regimented you can stay in your processes, the more successful rotations can be. And more importantly, the more you can focus on things like execution, timing, decision-making, as limited to things that just make you more successful within your rotation, as opposed to, I'm going to pivot to this, I'm going to go over to that, I'm going to...
Because I guess in a lot of the systems that we're talking about, and it's very common to be quite reactionary. You know, we get to the early spring and we suddenly decide that there's a paddock that needs to come out, and then we just trying to make some decisions about how we're going to do and what's going to go in next. And I guess if it's in a program and we know that yes, in spring this paddock is now going to follow the rotation, then it takes away. We may have done some cleanup the year before, or there's some things that we've done because we know exactly what that rotation is going to be. So instead of being reactionary, it's in a planned program.
Exactly. And a good example, that is a really good example to lead into the topic. And so we should really start at the start and just identify that at the most simplistic rotation you could have on a grass farm in New Zealand is actually going grass to grass.
From grass that's running out, or is it getting towards the end of its life, back into another grass.
Correct. And that can be the most simplistic rotation that exists in your farming landscape. And what are the decisions to make in a scenario like that? Well, the biggest and highest principle of doing pasture renovation and going grass to grass is that you are identifying a poor performing paddock on your property, and you are wanting to correct it for all the problems: drainage, invasive weeds, fertility, subdivision, any of these things that may be responsible for it being at the bottom of your paddocks for production, and you're wanting to fix them in a small process and move on to a perennial pasture as fast as possible. That is the most simplistic approach to grass to grass paddock renovation.
And it's really interesting. You make the point that you should be focusing on your poorest performing paddock, and that actually raises the question that do people know what the poorest performing paddock is, and how do they know that?
Well, straight up, when you ask that question, you also highlight that the most inefficient thing you can do on a farm is not acknowledge your poorest performer paddock, because if you don't take the time to, and this is why you and I have debates over this forever, but at the lowest hanging fruit for judging a paddock's performance, farmers on average should be capturing grazing days. And at the end of the year, you should have a big list of grazing days, and the paddock that has the lowest amount of grazing days has literally provided the least amount of productivity to your farming enterprise.
And that could be because of its aspect, or it is a poorly drained paddock, or it could be there may be some other characteristics that you can't change, but there are also some characteristics, and you've named those: fertility, probably weed species, potentially the age of those of the grasses in there that can be remedied. Compaction's a great one, and so I think I like the idea of being able to track how many stock it fed, or and sometimes in terms of pasture cover, how many grazings it got per year.
Yeah, correct.
It's to be able to identify which are the poorer performing paddocks.
And it's just, and when I talk about grazing days, and I always challenge, ironically, you're the animal component here, but I always challenge you with this, is that it is a proxy for actual yield.
Absolutely.
And because those animals have been given an apparent intake, and when you put 600 sheep in a paddock and they last for 10 days, you've got an equation for grazing days.
Absolutely.
And if they graze 6 times a year and you have different mob sizes, different stock classes, you can still convert based on stocking clarifications between cattle and sheep. You can actually still work it out exactly how many grazing days a paddock's had. I feel it's a nice one to just identify that you're not being inefficient in your cost outlay for regrassing by going to a paddock you don't like, but actually performs okay, versus a paddock that sits at the bottom of your production list in your farm that has no reason other than it's full of brown top, or it's full of thatch. It's not responding to nutrient that you're applying. It's not an efficient paddock. It's got everything going for it, but you haven't got the grazing days out of it.
So I think when we start this simple rotation, we're looking for the bottom performing paddock, and as you said, we need to be able to clearly identify that through either grazing days or some other measurement of yield that comes out of that. So once we've got that poorest performing paddock, what's our next step?
Well, I think we need to go and not ignore what we've just described. We've got to do soil tests. We've got to identify why it's possibly at the bottom of that list. It might involve taking a spade out and checking for compaction. Likely, in most conditions in New Zealand, it's an invasive grass weeds that are non-productive, such as brown top, which is a thatch-forming grass, ties up underneath productive grasses and ties up a lot of nutrient particularly, and competes for nutrient and doesn't convert to growth. Often it's with low legume contents, another big trait of a paddock you may not value on your property. The second point, though, is pretty big, and it's invasive weed species, most of which by the time you're talking about a long-term aging pasture that's not performing, they're mostly perennial hard-to-kill weeds. So they could be anything from the thistle families to docks, and a number of other actually quite hard to kill species like yarrow. So these species may build up, and they all are competing for your valuable nutrient and not converting to stock feed, and reducing the total productivity of your paddock and also the management of those paddocks.
It's really interesting just on that point. And we've got an experiment running at the moment where we've got a pasture that's an age of in excess of 50 years, and we've been applying the same nutrient to that and using animals to graze on that, which is aligned to the amount it grows. And currently, it's really interesting. It's sitting at about the old pasture with the same nutrient is sitting at about 65% of a pasture that's 1 or 2 years old, with new variety and new species in there, and new varieties and clover. And so having old pasture, even though it looks really good, there's quite large differences in terms of productivity between that and a newly established pasture.
Yeah, well, those sort of weak pastures on your property, and we don't want to dwell on this. We want to start building how you move from A to B in this topic. But you can't ignore the fact that once paddocks are becoming degraded and they are or naturalized, you tend to find their shoulder growth periods are shorter and shorter and shorter. So you've got tougher grazing conditions in autumn. You're slower to respond in spring. Your windows of productivity are down to a 3-month window.
Yeah, narrow shoulders.
Narrow shoulder of growth. And that has been reflected in this topic. I can't emphasize you've nailed it. this will be one of the most dramatic demonstrations of using the same fertility profile and getting so much less meat, which we've measured now, and that's 3.5 years old, going into its 4th year at the moment. And like you say, we're producing 40% less meat in this 50-year-old paddock for exactly the same amount of phosphate input and nitrogen inputs. Now, the phosphate input is actually lower because we're targeting a phosphorus range in it, so we're not putting as much phosphate on, but that's because it's not leaving the farmlet. Yeah. So we're not putting quite as much phosphate on, but we're putting the same amount of nitrogen on and not getting the response. Yeah. Beautiful example, a beautiful future target for targeting for pasture renovation to take that from a low-performing, low-responding pasture to a high-performing, high-responding pasture.
So we've talked about a grass-to-grass, but let's say in that pasture, for example, we might not want to go from grass to grass because there are some challenges. And what they be that change the rotation and the rotation length?
Well, if you don't mind, I think the nice way of approaching this one is in the South Island of New Zealand, particularly where we're based, we would only sow tall fescue pastures in the spring. And tall fescue is a relatively slow establishing species. It doesn't spread in its rows a lot. And I would like to use that as a really strong demonstration of using an example of an old pasture that has got a lot of rhizomatous weed species, particularly, and some of those can't be killed in the spring successfully. And we're about to put in a relatively expensive but highly perennial pasture species like tall fescue. And so I'm about to have a big outlay this spring because I value it, and on Marshdale, using that as the beet property that we've discussed before as an example, our tall fescue pasture has produced the most meat for the last 10 years per hectare.
Absolutely.
And so let's say we're going to move from a 50-year-old pasture full of thatch. It's got dandelions, it's got dock, it's got yarrow, it's got brown top, and the typical time for sowing tall fescue is in the spring.
Yeah.
And some of those species are quite hard to fully kill in the spring. And so it's a really nice example of knowing I'm about to spend a lot of money on a species that could last in our pasture system for well in excess of 10 years in this landscape. What could kill that in the future could be contamination by brown top, contamination by hard to kill rhizomatous wheatgrasses and weeds. So you don't want to just rush your renovation program, spend all that money for those weed species to turn up within 6 months.
Yeah.
So the best example I would give to our future renovation rotation for this example would be acknowledging that you're a cold environment. You've got opportunities to create more winter feed by putting in a strategic crop like oats, sown in middle of autumn. That means you are blowing out your pasture for its first herbicide knockdown in the middle of autumn, when a lot of those rhizomatous species and hard to kill species are drawing all their energy down into their roots. So you have this really great opportunity to have a larger knockdown of the existing hard to kill weed species.
Yep.
You're actually putting something in the ground that's going to benefit your farm system. Being in a cold environment, a winter feed source is never not really, really useful. So we could have put in our Manta Italian ryegrass or a Milton oats, and boom, you've got yourself a really strong feed wedge that's highly successful and highly useful. And then what you're doing is you're using that for a specific short time frame, looking to help use that grazing cycle to continue to break down the thatch that exists from having a longer term pasture breaking down. And then when you come to spring, you knock that out again as another form of weed control. And you've got yourself a really good tilth in your pasture. You're ready to sow a really valuable perennial species, and you've had 2 distinct knockdown phases for killing hard to kill grass weeds and broadleaf weeds.
And I think the other point there, then, you make a really good point in terms of this thatch, right? And actually, no chemical application is going to get rid of that thatch, but certainly grazing through the winter, where we are, creating some damage events on the top of the surface through that thatch, is a wonderful way of getting rid of that before we go into our
breaking it up All the dung and urine from winter grazing, all of that stimulates the breakdown of that thatch, particularly as everything's been killed and it's just dead material lying in the ground. So all that needs is a nutrient cycle to actually get the bugs going, and boom, they'll start breaking it down. So by the time you get to September, if you've done a program like this, it brings in a lot of opportunities for the spring sowing, because if you put in an oat or an annual ryegrass, use annual for the short-term rotation, when you terminate that in the spring, quite often you're able to utilize it down to a very low residual, and what it really opens up the opportunity for direct drilling until fescue into the ground without further cultivation or touching the ground. So you've sort of earned the right to use direct drilling for a slow establishing species like tall fescue. You've earned the right, and you've actually already started breaking down the thatch. Technically, there should be actually very little material at the time of sowing, so you don't have the slugs building up on a heap of thatch and dead material. And so you sort of earned the right to go into a slow establishing species and expect not to be decimated by slugs.
And I guess when you come to that spring period, and this is where you might deviate away from for a little bit from your rotation, is if you were still seeing some of those hard to kill weeds, or if you were still seeing that you hadn't quite had the knockdown of your rhizomatous grass species, you could actually add another rotation onto the end of that in terms of cleaning that up.
You could go through summer crop. And so that would be a naturally mid-spring sown summer crop, creating a knockdown then, putting the summer crop in. Typically, when if we're staying with the tall fescue theme of sowing it into late summer, you don't want to drift into autumn.
Yes.
Because it's very responsive to temperature, and you still want to be during a warm period of time to establish it. So whatever choices you make it a single graze summer effective time. Now, remembering any one of these may fit into your greater feed supply need, but you shouldn't lose sight of your primary aim is to reestablish a perennial pasture inside a window of time that makes it most successful as possible.
Yeah, because I like the idea that this is to clean up weed species, but the ability to stack yield, and so a lot of these crops in the rotation actually add to the amount of forage that's been grown in that paddock over the year.
And that again is a great segue into moving from a grass-to-grass rotation, which can be simple as a double spray knockdown from one old pasture to a brand new pasture in the shortest possible time frame. Logically, you want a double spray. Often people attempt to value that feed dramatically, therefore they don't like days out of grass. So the windows of the second spray can be very tight in some production systems. I would always challenge listeners to remember, if you're dealing with the lowest performing paddock on your property, the amount of feed you're foregoing is much, much less than you always project.
Yeah.
You know,
good point.
This paddock is not growing like the rest of your farm. You think you can't afford to take it out and leave it out for a period of time, but you're about to take it from a very low production state to a really good production state very fast. And so 10 days more for a double spray knockdown is relatively insignificant compared to being at the bottom of your production cycle and about to become one of the better performing paddocks on your property.
So take the Marshall example for example. What we're seeing there is if you were taking that 50-year-old pasture out, you go, I can't do without it. But interestingly, if you were able to do a double spray and get back into grass, you could almost, not quite, double the production of it.
Absolutely.
For a relatively small period of not having it.
And the overall message of everything we talk about is timing is everything. And, you know, delaying timing because you don't think you can afford to do it is actually the biggest flaw you could actually have, because the relativity of what you're delaying for is so small on the scale of what you're dealing with. It's such a short window of a moment of stress and time for the outcome. It's just, you can't afford to delay timing. And that's a big principle of setting up rotations, because rotations have defined timing. And once you're in a rotation, you know you've got a window you must fit. And it is a great lead in, though, into, you know, discussing what rotations look like for winter cold environments, because this is the critical scenario I'll give you, is that in New Zealand we could be defined by two classical regional scenarios, where if you have a cold winter and grass does not grow, winter crops are highly valuable in a rotation, a pasture renovation rotation.
Almost critical. But
they define your carrying capacity
absolutely.
to unleash upon your spring surplus. Animals eating spring growth highly efficiently is defined by how many animals you can carry through a cold winter when your pastures are not growing. And so, yes, you could do it on all grass, but it means you're foregoing lots of autumn grazing. And that's, again, because you're using autumn deferred feed, i.e. not grazing it through autumn to graze it through winter. So you're in a declining stocking rate scenario. So if you're wanting to maintain your stocking rate and power your stocking rate in a cold environment where pastures don't grow in winter, you very much, pivot your rotations and pasture renovation rotations around implementing winter cropping profiles. So we'll deal with this one, or just discuss this one first. And the nature of this is that you tend to find in cold winter environments, a lot of the pasture renovation occurs in the springtime. Because
after the winter crop,
correct? Because in cold cold winter environments, not always are we. We tend to be in slightly higher rainfalls. We're not defined by summer dry specifically in the New Zealand temperate scenario, and so you tend to find what we do is we capture spring moisture and early summer moisture to establish long maturity brassica crops to be carried into winter. As part of our pasture renovation program. So again, you're looking for your weakest pastures. You're saying, I'm going into a winter crop system. In the winter crop system, depending on exactly which one you pick, you have a series of weed control options, most of which are capable of controlling long-term, hard-to-kill pasture weeds. Some of them create problems around short-term weeds, but when it comes to the long-term pasture weeds, most winter cropping cycles are able to help you manage those. So you're coming out in spring, you've got a really defined window of time out of that pasture into your winter crop sowing dates. And this is where this discussion is around, can I afford to take it out now because I've got a hard spring, I don't have enough cover. And it keeps coming back to this point is that you must focus on the big picture. The window of time for winter cropping sowing dates is pretty defined as a two to possibly 3 week window at the very most. And if you delay taking your pasture out for that time frame because you think you can't afford to, and you miss your window, you impact your establishment window for these winter crops. So once you're committed to a pasture renovation phase, you must commit to it. You must spray out. You must prepare well because you need to get these crops in on time.
And I think that's the nice thing about actually the whole topic around rotations is it's the discipline of doing those things on time. You know what's coming. You should be able to prepare for that. And even you make the example where you've got a really cold spring and you go, I can't take this out. If you know it's coming out, there's other things, there's other provisions that you probably can make. And so I think I like the idea of these rotations because it does set some disciplines in terms of going, here's your timing, and regardless of what else is happening, I need to get these things sprayed out.
Yep. And so then we move to what is a rotation. We've just discussed a decision, right? A decision is to go from an old pasture to a winter crop. Yep. That's not a rotation.
No.
That is a one-off decision to put a crop in. The rotation is how does that end up in a perennial pasture again that may last for 8 to 10 years in these same climates
Absolutely.
We're discussing.
Yep.
So how does that look, just using an example of a simple version of this in a New Zealand farm system? Well, if you're in a winter cold environment and you've got a little bit of summer moisture, you're a little bit cooler through the summer, that first out of grass may be, for example, to a swede crop, which is a bulb brassica crop. And the key is you would lead with that because Swedes are very, very susceptible to multi-cropping. So you don't have an option of sowing Swedes twice. So you start with a Swede and a rotation. It's put in the ground in late spring, early summer. And by early spring the following year, the ground is ready for another decision in your rotation to be made. Quite regularly, This is actually because people do not want to move too fast across their properties. And so winter cropping is also a way of not moving too fast across and renovating your pasture. So you perceive that your pastures are okay. You don't need to have a high level of renovation. You're out beyond about the 8 to 10 year mark for perenniality of your pasture. So getting a new paddock to renovate every year sometimes doesn't fit your business model. So therefore you're probably looking to have a second crop. So when that swede is out, you might make a decision to move to kale, for example. And if you move to kale, again, your sowing date is very late in spring and even into early summer for the kale for the second winter rotation. You may consider to use that bare ground phase to put some oats in for green chop silage or direct feeding. And so your decision might be, I have a mild period of time in end of winter where I can actually cultivate this paddock briefly, because sometimes you get windows in the winter conditions. Then I could actually put some oats in the ground and recognize they're there to catch up any nutrient, any free nutrient that's sitting in the bare ground. You might also find, though, to succeed in an economic silage by the middle to the end of spring, prior to sowing the next winter crop, you need more nutrient, because to grow enough silage to be economic, you actually need to have enough nutrient to drive that, and not always is there enough free nutrient left after a winter crop phase. It's often much less than you realise, and the best analogy of this is actually, if you don't put extra nutrient on it, quite often these green catch crops don't produce enough yield to be an economic process. So you need to top it up at the end to drive them on to a decent economic yield, and then back into a winter crop.
Yeah, so this is really stacking yield across time.
Yep. For example, you might end up with a 12 to 14 tonne swede crop. You might end up with a 5.5 to 6 tonne green chop silage crop. You can put a kale in the ground that might end up being 14 tonne. And so suddenly over a period of time, you can see how you brought a lot of dry matter into that rotation.
And that's probably really important too, with the smaller the properties are and the higher the winter stocking rate, right? It's you've got too much area out to keep that rotation going. So you actually do need to
crop multiple times.
And as you say, there's probably a logical sequence in terms of which of those brassica or beet crops come first, and then some of the brassicas come afterwards.
Correct.
So there's a logical sequence.
And because this is the topic of the discussion, is that we should mention that, like, always go first with swedes. And by always going first with swedes, you know you haven't got any other brassica in its recent past, because that is the threat of brassica diseases such as clubroot particularly, which is much more severe on swedes than it is on kale, for example. But then if you're really needing to stack them, recognise that fodder beet is not a brassica.
I was going to ask, where does fodder beet fit in here?
Yeah, and in the New Zealand system, it is a really wonderful opportunity to bring a non-brassica species into a wintering rotation. If I was really to criticise the position we've taken in New Zealand on the styles and winter feed we're doing, the reality is we are all too much in one camp or another. You're either a kale grower but not a fodder beet grower. You're either a swede grower but not a fodder beet grower. You may be kale and fodder beet but not swedes. What is attractive is recognising that it's not either or. Building a farm system around utilising both offers more resilience in the long term from plant diseases.
Yeah, the power of actually using 2 or even 3 in a rotation is the benefit of being able to stack yield without running into some of those issues with brassica to brassica.
Correct. And how you do that is you just need to work your feed budget out to know how much you need. So, for example, if you have a lot of cattle and you've got some light cattle, and every year you have about 100 to 300 light cattle in your system, you may consider putting in only enough fodder beet to feed that stock class, whereas your kale might be your young animals or your older animals, and your swedes might be your sheep. And so you've always got a defined stock class for a group of decisions you make, and you'll have about the same every year. So you can still form rotations based on different feed options. So typically looking at that, a 2-wintering system would be a really traditional rotation for a cold winter environment. Grass out in spring into your first winter crop. You may consider a catch crop after that first winter crop. You go into a second winter crop in the early summer of the next year, and then you're through that into the next spring, where you may consider putting in your perennial pasture in the spring. And that's a really good example of a rotation in a cold environment. So what might change? You might consider coming out of the second winter crop, and you might consider, for example, putting a whole crop barley crop in. So you come out of your winter crop very early in September or early spring, you put in barley specifically for taking it through for whole crop cereal. It's one of the earliest whole crop options or cereal silage options you've got, and you will have a window of time to sow your perennial pasture after that is still really good for temperature. So that's a really nice example of stacking in another 8 to 10, maybe 12 tonnes of yield post your
into that
second winter crop.
Yeah, into that calendar year. So we've talked about that winter cold example. Let's now talk about maybe a summer dry example, because I think that opens up some opportunities to potentially get some herbs and clovers into the system.
Absolutely.
Using that. So let's talk about a summer dry example where we've got spring moisture, and we're going to try and drive some high quality feed into the summer using one of these rotations.
And there's two really distinctive types of dryland farmers. There's basically unirrigated dairy farming, and there is dry land sheep and beef environments. And both of them have quite distinctive opportunities. I'll start with the dairy example because it's also quite simplistic. It is absolutely part of a pasture renovation program. You're absolutely making decisions on your lowest performing pastures within a dairy platform. Regularly, it's a persistence issue under wear and tear on a dairy farm. It's under bug pressure. It's under wet soil grazing management in winter. All of these things may lead to a decision to see a pasture as its lowest performing on the property. And the opportunity to use summer crop in the scenario is, again, to take spring moisture and take either a multi-graze option into summer or a single crop volume into summer to supply high digestibility, high protein feed into a landscape that may start becoming lower and lower in protein and higher in fiber, which is, for a dairy operation is very, very expensive, because if you don't have high digestibility and good protein levels in a dry summer, you're paying for that through supplements. So growing your supplement in the field is one of the cheapest opportunities to deliver protein to a milking cow. It often stimulates intake when other, digestibility is really low. They can eat more if they've got access to summer turnips, which is a one graze protein option in summer, protein and bulb. Leaf's got the protein, the bulb's got carbohydrate, but typically turnips are driven to supply protein in the summer. And in New Zealand at the moment, chicory would be one of those big rotations where we're putting the multi-graze chicory crop in, where you're aiming to graze it between 3 and 4 times. Now, this is really good, and using the chicory as a better example, turnips are pretty well defined. You're sowing them in a critical window at the middle to the end of the middle of spring. You must hit that window of time. You've got 75 to 95 days, depending on cultivar choice for maturity. You've got a single yield, and you've got a grazing window of about 40 days to be successful with turnips. And for most unirrigated dairy environments in a traditional sense, that window of 40 to 50 days is not unreasonable for a summer. However, with a bit of climate change, a bit of seasonal creep, we're seeing longer and longer summers being implemented. So we're looking at chicory as a multi-graze option that can last longer and longer into a summer. Because it's young, fresh with a deep root, you tend to find its vigor in a dry conditions in a dairy landscape is quite high. And in fact, it's often performing near its best when you need to take it out. And that's part of where the discussions come with the effectiveness of chicory in a dairy landscape. This is another species that the most important thing is to get it in on time. Yeah. And so here's a great example, is that, again, a dairy platform can be tight for feed in the middle of spring. The weakness with this is that you think you can't take your area out for summer cropping. So you're focused on a small immediate point of time, and then it pushes you late. And by definition, you're about to go into a dry land or a dry season condition. So as your sowing dates get later and later, you get more exposed to dry soil conditions during germination. And so your chances of not being successful get greater and greater. And what happens when you're not successful with a multi-graze crop is that you lose grazing days. And when you lose grazing days, you lose regrowth cycles. And when you lose regrowth cycles, you become less and less economic.
There's a real theme here, and you make an incredibly good point here, and that's where when we have these defined rotations, come back to it's the discipline of getting things in on time. And I think your point around chicory is it's basically robbing you yield if you haven't got the discipline of getting it in on time.
For example, there might be people going around and say, I can't grow enough in a 6-month or 5-month period from chicory to justify putting it in. However, if you put it in early, i.e. the middle of spring, you get it up and going under great conditions. By the following mid to late autumn, depending on how long your dry goes, you have simply got the time to graze it 5 times. And when you do the calculations on dry matter production at maybe about 2,800 kilograms of dry matter per grazing, closing in on 3 ton per grazing, you can start to do your maths on, how valuable is that protein. 1 grazing is very expensive. 2 grazings is still quite expensive. 3 grazings is probably starting to break even. 4 grazings is incredibly good value protein in your farm system. 5 grazings is exceptionally cheap protein. Yeah. And so your decisions often lead to, do I get 2 grazings or 3? But making great decisions puts you in the show to get 4 or 5 grazings, which makes chicory amazingly effective. Yeah. So you define that by how much you value getting things on time versus the stress of a moment that paddock's still valuable for me for 1 grazing, of which is it that valuable because it's a run out pasture.
Yeah. And remembering, again, this is part of a pasture renewal program.
Taking your worst paddocks to your best paddocks.
Yep. And if you can, as you say, there's there could be 12 tons of high quality feed. And the other point I was going to make is it's at a time in a production cycle that could make all the difference to milk production, for example.
100%.
And so not only are you producing more feed, but you're producing it in a rotation, you're producing it at a time where you can make the maximum value out of it.
And for every kg of that you don't have, you've only got 2 options. You dry off cattle early and you lose days in milk, or you put expensive supplementary feed in to compensate for it. And remember, we're not chasing energy, we're chasing protein. When the landscape is brown, protein is the biggest limitation in that diet, and you tend to find that's quite expensive through those summer months.
So what was the other?
So pivoting back out into the sheep and beef world, which is harder and drier, longer dry, often in hotter landscapes, and that's why some of them aren't already dairy farming, for example. So the reality is you're dealing in a whole different system. And here again is that you're more expansive, the properties are often bigger, you've got multiple stock classes, often all economics around summer cropping rotations for pasture renovation and a sheep and beef operation are driven by what I can get off finishing. But let's not dwell on that. That's covered in podcasts around capital stock feeding, finishing animals on regrowth brassicas. We've already covered those things. Let's just deal with the rotation. And so you've got often you've got bigger farms with more scope, larger paddocks. So one of the things you sort of identify in these landscapes is that the fertility regimes can be much more variable. The invasive species in dryland environments can be much more variable, from large-scale thistles to again, thatch pastures. And so we are looking at a renovation program that's starting often in dryland farming with a summer crop. Often we go out of pasture straight into rape species because rape, Brassica napus, is still one of the most resilient summer dry crops we have. There's a couple of other good examples that fit that category as well, but we'll use that as an example. And, we are going in there recognising that we've got a target window for grazing through the middle of summer, but recognising that in sheep and beef dryland environments, a summer crop may actually need to be taken right out through to autumn before you might consider putting something else in. And so some of them are multi-graze and they carry on well into autumn, and some of them may even be taken into the winter. So looking at a dryland rotation to get to, for example, let's say a lucerne stand. Good example where we're aiming to put lucerne in a spring in a future date. The lucerne's down for 8 years and we're trying to create a rotation. So we come out of pasture, we're focusing on pH, we're wanting to address it early. We'll use the cropping phase to improve pH for a future lucerne stand. We'll use the cropping phase to kill a lot of hard to kill weed species, particularly some of the grass species, which we can tidy up in the lucerne phase, but some of the hard to kill stuff requires a cropping phase, and also target some of the more traditionally hard to kill broadleaf weeds such as dandelions and some of the more difficult perennial weeds that compromise lucerne longevity.
Yeah, and as you say, you can do that in the lucerne, but what you're probably saying is, I need to do it twice.
Yeah.
And if one's in the lucerne, the other one's got to be in that cropping rotation.
Well, the thing about it is, if we have dandelions at the start of the cropping rotation, logically your lucerne's not going to get to 8 years of age because you'll be sick of the amount of dandelions in that landscape, and horehound and other species that are detrimental to longevity of lucerne in the New Zealand landscape are all difficult to kill once they're in the lucerne.
And the other thing that really strikes me is, so we're doing this from a rotation point of view, but and you've got this sheep example, but you're doing it with a crop where if you've got that in the autumn and it is the only thing that you're able to flush use on, for example, some of the results that I've been privy to in terms of scanning percentages after that, you've got a highly digestible crop, a really good protein source, and
improving live weight, and despite maybe the rest of the farm looking very ordinary and being brown, you get the best scanning results you've ever got because you've actually directed to this crop. Correct. So not only are you in a cropping rotation, but you've picked the crop to fit the animal system and you might be grazing that for 6 weeks. Correct. That 6 weeks might set you up for the rest of the year because you've applied that to the animal at a time where it will respond to it. 100%. But you've got to remember it's still part of a rotation.
It's still part of a rotation.
And therefore, you've got a process that I'm in a summer dry environment. I require summer feed. I'll either use that to finish some lambs that I think I've got a margin on. If I haven't, I've got young breeding stock that need to be grown to a higher potential, and then I actually can make money on the tupping phase where I might increase my reproductive status by 10% just by having the crop in the ground, and that's quite a big dollar value. Second thing is I'd probably be doing that on imported grain. Yes. If I didn't have the crop there. So that's a cost structure that is immediately there. So if I don't have that renovation cropping rotation in place for a traditional dry, I don't have anything of high quality at a time. I might get parasite resistance show up. I've got stock going backwards on brown pasture as far as I can see. These sort of hubs are also feed into a whole lot of other strategies. But the big one is I'm trying to get from an old degraded pasture to a new pasture system. And we're going to use lucerne as the example. So I would personally pull the plug straight after that event. I'd tup on it. I hope I'm not in a too cold environment because my tupping would be quite late, which is our mating phase. And but if it's early enough, I get them out. I think I'd smack some oats straight into that because remember, my main aim is to get to a highly valuable lucerne paddock with as many weeds controlled as possible and have earned the right to have a long-lasting lucerne stand by actually cleaning the paddock prior to that event. So my rotation is out of old pasture, which could be full of baggage, knock down that, put a summer crop in, work that through, take it right through to when I can get it through. If I can get that summer crop out early, I might go into annual ryegrass. It might be more useful in total all the way through to the spring sowing, but I'm definitely not complicating the system by adding other species. I want a simplistic system because I want to use as much herbicide to kill as many hard to kill weeds as possible because my end target is to get a clean, healthy, young lucerne stand that's going to last for a long period of time. So I've improved my pH. I've taken 12 months to achieve that via this cropping phase. I've killed hard to kill weeds in 2 cycles, one in the original knockdown, 2 in the autumn knockdown prior to sowing oats. If I still have baggage, I can work on that all the way through winter and early spring before my knockdown to start my lucerne rotation.
And I think the other thing, and these are some of the benefits of doing this, is, and I want to pick up on a point you made earlier around internal parasites. And so if you've got one of these old degraded pastures with plenty of brown top in there, you will have a lot of L3 infective larvae. And the ability to actually get a lot of those grass weeds out means that you're not going to harbour as many of those infective larvae, and the challenge in your new pasture is going to be very low.
And so just to put that in perspective, if it wasn't just about lucerne, you're wanting to bring in a perennial pasture mixture that has chicory in it or plantain in it, the reality is you need to control all these things too. And those two species could be very, very useful. Red clover, very, very useful in this discussion of L3 larvae transfer. And so your pasture full of herbs and clovers will support the animals in so much greater way, both in the infection rates, but also in the nutritional profile.
Absolutely. And the other...
But you have to earn the right.
You've got to earn the right.
You've got to earn the right to clean your land, to use those options.
Yes.
And I feel that's the important concept of rotation.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, so imagine you're sitting there with this old pasture, it's the opportunity to get new genetics in. So some of the new genetics that are late flowering, that have got different endophytes in it, you've got the opportunity to do that if you're prepared to go. And I like that the terminology. You've got to earn the right to have a new pasture by making sure you clean up some of the harm or the baggage from previous.
Or just what longevity brings to this.
What longevity brings.
So I do think we need to finish the whole discussion with the sort of the epitome of putting pasture rotations together by stacking feed on a farm, or driving feed systems on a farm by literally stacking yields. And there's no better example of this than designing sort of rotations for runoffs for dairy support. Now, these rotations are regularly defined by the scope of any individual property. So if the property's got a very small footprint, the reality is the rotation is tight. And so you're moving between multiple winter crops with really narrow windows in between.
So when you say tight, it's tight between crops?
Yeah, because you don't have the land area to give you the scope to expand your rotation. I'll probably want to bring up one of my favorite rotation systems, which would require a reasonable amount of land area. So this is an example where you've got the scope of your area to actually have a rotation that is in pasture for about 3 to 5 years.
Right.
And it's the time you're in pasture defines the scope and the intensity of your block. And so I'm going to define it by my grass can be in the ground between 3 and 5 years before I must cycle back to a high performance wintering crop and a feed rotation. So I'm going to give an example of a runoff rotation that I think is just can be really cool. So typically it can actually start with either, but traditionally it would start with a fodder beet. So you come out of pasture when the soil has been regenerated in a pasture grazing system, and you're coming out of a pasture hopefully with the soil in good condition because it's been rotationally grazed over the previous 3 to 5 years, and you're coming into a fodder beet, which is exceptionally high yielding potential in New Zealand. But because the soil has just been sort of literally regenerated via the rotational grazing with the ryegrass, red clover, chicory plantain sort of rotation pasture, hopefully the root structures of the fodder beet coming out of pasture at their best. The soil should be looking in good condition. So we're going to grow a big crop of beet. So that's going in the middle of spring, and it's being grazed in the following autumn and winter. And then from that, we come out of that beet, and we may be having one eye on another crop because we're trying to stack yield. So we're probably going to drop some oats into that, and probably in the most landscapes that this sort of system occurs, particularly in the central South Island, we could probably get oats in between August and early September. We're going to fire those oats up with extra nutrient in the middle of that regrowth cycle or the growth cycle, and we're going to cut that as green chop silage, no seed head coming out, just at the boot stage. So we're going to have a milking quality oat silage, and then we're going to put kale back in the ground. That kale will stay in the ground and be started to be grazed to the following early winter. And after that, we may put in a whole crop cereal silage. And that is going to be harvested in the middle of summer at a time we can actually put our perennial pasture or hybrid pasture back in the ground. And then we're going to, so we've just defined the rotation that fits. We've got coming out of pasture into beet, out of beet into green chop silage, out of green chop silage into kale, out of kale into whole crop cereal silage, and out of whole crop cereal silage in the start to early summer into either a shorter term pasture based on an Italian or hybrid ryegrass that might take you from 2 to 3 years, or my preferred option, which is a perennial pasture that will take you to 3 to 5 years and give you the flexibility of taking you out at any of that point of time. And when you start to add that up, in our systems, you may grow 22 to 25 tons of dry matter in your fodder beet. You may grow 5 to 6 tons of dry matter in your whole crop, your green chop silage. You may then grow another 12 to 14 tons of dry matter in your kale. You may grow 10 tons of dry matter in your whole crop cereal silage. And then you've got the pasture you're putting in early enough in the season to possibly go straight into a silage system, because these are often large-scale silage operations on these runoffs, and then shut up some grass for winter feed. And so you can accumulate, if you sow early enough, about 6 to 8 tons of dry matter before the 1st June of the 3rd winter.
Yeah. So,
and I've just stacked a lot of yield on this property in this one paddock over a period of 2.5 years before going back to a longer term pasture.
and if you think about it, if you were cleaning out at the end of each crop, if you had some problem weeds, right, I've counted 4, if not 6 times where you would be able to apply a weed control and tidy up. So it's I like those rotations, and basically they could be set, and they're the dates you could say from now on, these are the dates you have to get out of. Because I think one of the I just want to touch really briefly on some of the challenges of these systems. And the first one I would say, and I've suffered this, is when you have a rotation and you know that you've got to a point where you need to take a pasture out, for example, to carry on the rotation, but that pasture's looking super good and it's maybe almost at the peak of its powers, and you're being asked to spray that out. That can be quite difficult.
Yeah. So that's exactly how I actually think. My interpretation of that in a high performance system, particularly on runoffs, is, as bad as that sounds, spraying out almost perfectly good pasture, that for me personally is the definition of success.
Yeah.
Because the detail, it's all in the detail. You can make many, many choices about the category and the style of grass you put into your rotation, but I can't emphasize enough the idea that your pasture is still doing 100% of its potential at the time you're spraying it out is so much more effective than the small difference in cost and putting in the difference between, for example, a hybrid ryegrass that might last 3 years but could go to 5, but between 3 and 5 could be in significant decline to such a point that you may actually have to use an extra cost in your system and stitch in to get it to last its rotation, versus a high-performance perennial pasture that can tolerate a lot of winter wear, be utilised through silage systems full of red clover. And the reality is that perennial pasture could, in many of your systems, be as good as the day you've sown it when you're pulling it out. You should not feel bad about that, because you have just captured a large amount of extra dry matter at the end of your rotation, where on the average property, those rotations are regularly in decline and has been in decline for 1, if not 2 years, because your detail of what you've chosen to use is not firing at 100% of what it was in its first 2 years. Remember, these things are amazing in their first 2 years, but if your rotation length is actually too long for actually their longevity and how they tolerate wear on the sort of property or life by bugs or whatever, the point being is that the inefficiency of not producing close to 100% at the end of that rotation is really high.
So that's a really good point. The next one is, and we often, particularly if you haven't got a cropping mindset, every time you establish a new pasture, you go through this risky period at establishment, right? And I guess if you, one way of looking at this is if you minimize the number of times you establish, then you minimize the risk. But I guess in this situation, the risk is minimized by holding those really good timelines and going in where you've got the best chance of establishment, and you get benefit from doing that.
Well, for example, an example I might have just used about coming out of whole crop barley into a perennial pasture in the middle of summer would almost define that I am either summer safe or I'm irrigated.
Yep.
So you still would base your building of your rotation about your key windows of establishment of your final outcome. I wouldn't use whole crop cereal if I was dry land.
No, of course.
Because all I'd be doing is sucking moisture out of my profile and really moderating my end outcome. I would either set up for an early spring crop and then leave a summer fallow, but you may not value that. So I might go to a summer cropping system and graze heifers or young breeding animals on it, and then consider a sowing window later in autumn when the season is broken. So it does impact your choices, your actual knowledge of your own landscape. But the point is, once you build a rotation, it is like you've already commented on and responded to a couple of times, a lot of it is set.
Yeah,
your feed budgeting, your stock classes, your silage requirement, the sheer dynamics of your feed system are pretty set. And so your decisions are quite, minimal. It's timing and execution that become the thing, but designing the rotation is the art.
Yeah, and I think maybe for some people who want to do a rotation but don't necessarily have the skills, there are certainly people out there that are able to come in and help with designing those rotations.
Well, the way I look at it is we bandy around the word farm systems an awful lot, but our team are particularly good at helping people design long-term rotations to get from A to B, cleaning all the way and or fulfilling critical feed gaps and goals. But the whole idea is this is the rotation for the next 10 to 12 years, 10 to 14 years. And in that time, we'll go through pasture, we'll go through multiple cropping phases. So the destiny of that paddock should be set in its place in a rotation. The worst thing of getting this wrong, the worst thing of missing the detail, putting the wrong grass in, putting the wrong endophyte, dying early, is you have to skip back in your rotation to fix it. And the detail of your choices that you make have bigger ramifications for keeping inside your rotations. Complication often comes through failure.
Yeah,
because you're spinning faster.
Yeah, good point.
And I can't emphasize, one of my favorite statements in recent times particularly is the devil's in the detail. You can ask whatever question you like, but the devil sits in the detail of the question. And in this case, I'm not lasting long enough. Well, why didn't we put coxfeed in those mixtures? Why didn't we put something that was definitely going to get to the rotation length in those mixtures or make those choices? Why didn't we pick the right endophytes? You name it. The detail defines the success in the rotation length.
Okay, so in terms of summary, I think this has been I think quite enlightening in terms of the things that you think about when you're designing rotations, and we've said this could be going from a grass to grass, or it could be going from a grass through a number of different cropping cycles to get back to a perennial pasture or a lucerne or something that's going to be perennial in the system. And so when we think of it like that, there are some key decision times, but we can nail those down and we can actually have the rotation set for a paddock, for multiple years, knowing that there are some critical timings there. So I like the idea of the organisation. When we've got these rotations set, the organisation then almost falls out of that.
Absolutely.
And we minimise the risk of running into some of these issues with not hitting timing. Because I think you make the point really, really well. Most of the failures that we do see are all around timing. It was too late.
Most of the inefficiencies from the cost outlay are around timing.
Yep. So again, Why is it good to renovate pastures? And I think we've given a really good example in terms of our 50-year-old pasture and how it looks great, but the performance of it is not nearly as good as of young grass. So we like to get back to that period. I think you said before, everything looks good in its first 2 years, and we want to have more of that on farm. So actually getting young grass, I think, is a really good end goal. Certainly getting new genetics and new styles of grasses and endophytes, herbs and clovers in amongst that. I think that's another great reason that we're looking to set up these rotations and get to that end point. I think you've made the point really, really well about stacking yield. If you are producing maybe 12 or 13 tons off your grass pasture, you've probably got the opportunity in a 12-month period
or 18 months
to almost double that by stacking those crops together in a rotation that stacks yield. And then the final point, and one dear to my heart, is that you're also using these cropping cycles to pinpoint areas of an animal production cycle that you can have a big effect on. And I love the summer forage rape example where, yes, you could be finishing some lambs, but man, in terms of flushing ewes, getting better reproductive performance out of them, that's gold. And if it was only just doing that and your pasture, it's done its job. So I really like the way that we can these rotations can actually or will actually fit into those animal systems.
Like Juddy, you summarised that super well, and there's nothing to add. You've really done it. But I do still have one high level point, is that regularly the importance of rotations is to earn the right to get perenniality, earn the right to put things into your pastures that might give your farm benefits, earn the right to have clean, long-lasting lucerne, earn the right to put chicory into your farm landscape and not have thistles and other docks, and earn the right to use plantain and not have perennial weed species. All of those things every farmer can utilise. But if you don't create a rotation, you can't reflect back and say, I have weed burdens, I can't use these things, because the reality is you have not gone through a rotation with the thought of improving your landscape, so you earn the right to use difficult to use species.
Listen, it's been a fascinating discussion, Alistair. Thank you for that. Listen, I've just got to whip out. I've got to pick up the dog from the vet. It'll be a case of retrieving the retriever. So hopefully we'll see you next time.
Yeah, go well.